Scott, if you just want to kind of give us a rundown, of the bill and sort of what it would do, and kind of where things are with it right now in the legislature, then we can jump to Dan and Jesse just to kind of talk about what they're seeing from their worlds as well.
So the bill really sits at the intersection of two pretty important issues. One is criminal justice reform and ending the war on drugs. And the other is expanding access to treatment for mental health and addiction disorders. So fundamentally, the bill is fairly simple. It's decriminalizing possession and use of certain psychedelic drugs. So basically, the basic notion that let's stop arresting and prosecuting people for possessing and using these drugs. It does not decriminalize selling, possession and use for 21 and older. It also allows people to engage in shared or facilitated use. It's good to encourage people to, if they're going to use together and not alone. It's safer that way, and we want to make sure that facilitation can happen. There are people who help guide people through a psychedelic experience and so forth. And of course, we know that psychedelics, we've known it for more than 50 years, and we were starting to move towards more knowledge when the drug war started and shut everything down. But this, more growing information that psychedelics can be very beneficial in helping people who are suffering with mental health and addiction challenges. And more studies that have come out 50 years ago and today about the benefits for depression, for PTSD, for heroin addiction, and so forth, and people whose lives have been turned around, and who, including I know Jesse can talk about that firsthand. But the two sponsors of the bill are two organizations that work with combat veterans who've come home after serving and fighting for our country with significant mental health challenges, and psychedelics turn their lives around, save their lives in many ways. But tragically, they had to go out of the country to get psychedelic therapy because we make it illegal here. We also, as part of a coalition, have two parents who I happen to know. I used to work with one of them, who years ago their son, a teenage son, became addicted to heroin, was spiraling towards homelessness and death. They have means, so they tried every conceivable intervention and treatment, and nothing worked. And out of desperation, they flew him down to Mexico for an ibogaine program. Ibogaine is a plant-based psychedelic. He did that program, I think it was 12 or 15 years ago. He's never used since. It simply ended his heroin addiction. And so it's not a silver bullet. And of course, you always have to be mindful that any substance can be misused. But it has great promise. And we, of course, are all waiting to see what the FDA eventually does and potentially approving psychedelic therapy for different types of treatments. I'm not holding my breath. The FDA has yet to approve any treatment around medical cannabis after all these years. California needs to make our move to make clear that we're going to stop criminalizing these substances. And then the final piece of the bill, it creates a working group to make recommendations to the legislature about potential next steps. Should we certify therapists? Should we move towards a legalized market, and so forth? So that's the bill.
Thank you, Senator, for the overview. So as Scott mentioned, this does not remove any other criminal penalties in the code other than personal possession and use. It also includes a cap. So there's a limit to how much you can possess under the bill. These are high. There is very little potential for abuse, addiction, or negative outcomes with these substances, far less than legal substances today, like alcohol and nicotine. or other quote unquote hard drugs. So the safety and efficacy of these substances has been studied extensively, and as the senator mentioned, the FDA is reviewing that data as well, and may come up with sort of a legalized pathway from that perspective at some point. But in the meantime, people are suffering, and what we have, isn't working. I think that's the bottom line. And with that, I'll just kind of ask Jesse to share a little bit about his personal story. The coalition around this is broad. We have law enforcement, in support. We have retired law enforcement in support, as well as first responders, veterans, medical professionals at UCLA, UCSF, Johns Hopkins. I'm forgetting folks as well, but it's a very broad and diverse coalition. It cuts across ideology and political partisanship. We have, Republicans in support of the bill, conservative Democrats. It really is broadly popular, but also, not very well known in sort of the Sacramento policymaking world. So, Jesse, please pipe in here.
Happy to answer any questions. Pretty open book, so there's no need to dance around anything. So like I said, I was a non-commissioned officer, Army Ranger, 3 combat deployments Afghanistan, got out, went into finance. I just started hitting sort of a wall of depression, anxiety, alcoholism, for the normal veteran checklist. I went to the VA, and it was essentially the only options were the highway, the medication, and medication can definitely save lives, but I've also seen firsthand a lot of the damage it can do as well. And it also tends to be more in line with a maintenance protocol in terms that you are going to be on these or similar medications for probably the rest of your life, and not necessarily addressing the underlying issues. If you look at the VA statistics, they have like it's pretty abysmal, like a 33% success rate. They have huge dropout rates. The suicide epidemic, the estimates have been anywhere from 15, 17, or 22 vets a day commit suicide. It's hard to pin down those exact statistics, but what is pretty well understood is that military veterans are committing suicide at a much higher rate. And despite hundreds of billions of dollars, no program, no policy has been effective. There's a lot of blame to go around. It's sort of the nature of the beast. If you understand the VA system, even their suicide hotline, there was some like millions of unanswered calls from people legitimately trying to seek help. That was just released, I think, New York Times. There's a lot of problems, right? And so I found myself in this situation. Like, one, I'm not just willing to say like, hey, I have PTSD. This is what I am now. And so, never having done psychedelics, pursued it kind of with a little bit of open mind. So the reason we think it works, and there's a few different ones. MDMA, which is the chemical in ecstasy, but when it's used in a therapeutic setting, it's being shown to have tremendous benefits. So that's actually been 100% privately funded study through an organization called the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, and they're in third stage trials. They are set to pass third stage trials next year. So possibly veterans and others who have PTSD will be able to go to their therapist and get MDMA assisted therapy. That has had a 67% success rate of the treatment of anybody with treatment resistant depression, PTSD, excuse me. So these are the hardest cases. These are the cases that they lumped into a category of like, hey, we've tried everything, nothing works. And this is still having a 67% rate of not showing up any PTSD effects, which is unheard of in any sort of medical context. We're seeing pretty similar results with psychedelics across the board. There's long tradition, history, especially with psilocybin and one called ayahuasca, of indigenous tribes and communities using this. And they've been using it for thousands of years. One, because it is safe, but two, because they realize sort of the potential of it and the healing on many different levels, not only psychological, but we have indications of physical healing in terms of brain health, and then also there's sort of a spiritual kind of side of it of connectivity and as Senator Wiener said, the group dynamic, which is hard to come out. But so after my Aya experience, I went there, multiple ceremonies. I felt like it reset my brain. You know, again, coming in with complete skepticism of like, oh, this is drugs, I'm getting high. It was absolutely nothing like that. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. And, you know, the traumas are still there, the struggles are still there, but at least it gave me the tools and a little bit of the ability to get back on track, which I was able to do. And just from my own side of anxiety, depression, we're no longer like these steamrolling issues that affected me, that made me go down these other paths. And I just keep seeing that every single vet cohort. We've sent hundreds of vets to this. As Dan said, we have to send them to overseas because that's where it's legal. So, I mean, that in itself is a travesty. Our wait list has over 1,000 vets, and that's just completely word of mouth. And each one has been on therapy 10 years, 15 years. It's not uncommon for a veteran to be on 10 to 15 medications at any given time. And I just looked at numbers from the VA. If you look at the prescription rates, it's just like a J curve. It's an exponential curve going up, which in itself is an indication that they're not doing something right. So it's sort of novel. It's new. We're at the beginning of research, but we're partnered with University of Texas, Austin. We've worked with the University of Georgia. Stanford in California is doing bills on this. So it's getting the attention. It's just we're early stages, but that just because we're early stages does not mean we can't do it safely, effectively. And these veterans that we serve don't have the luxury of waiting for the FDA for 5-10 years. They don't have the luxury of waiting for the inefficient system that is the VA to understand how to use MDMA and train up those kind of people. Those are 10 to 20 year arcs. And like I said before, we have people right now that this is their last rope. So that's kind of what we're trying to push. It's purely out of the, you know, if they've tried everything else, why not? And why make them go to another country, and why not have conversations? It's the same thing with any other prohibition. The more you don't talk about it and the more you push in the shadows, that's where the danger comes. That's where we make these things worse. But if we actually start realizing, hey, there's something here, we might not know all of it, but let's figure this out together. And this group, veterans, I think deserve that, like every opportunity, every shot to get back their life.
Expand on the what the data shows on safety. I mean, as far as I know, it's pretty tough to overdose on a psychedelic, but I think a lot of people in the general public will be most familiar with various horror stories and anecdotal disasters. So I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what the data shows about the actual danger to people and lives from these drugs.
Dan has like all the statistics, but it's as with everything. Sometimes these horror stories are the things that become more prominent than the actual truth because they stick in our imagination, and we all grew up with the same kind of worries. The risk in terms of there's not really a overdose risk with something like psilocybin or these medicinal ones. Again, if you have the infrastructure to do proper intake where people aren't at risk of doing this in terms of a therapist and all that, again, you reduce it. The whole bad trip side of it, again, we've been doing this for 5 years, never had a bad trip because we do extensive preparation and we do it within the community. So even if it's a hard trip, they understand that they can use that for healing purposes. The bad trip comes when, somebody just gets dosed, they don't know what they're doing, they don't have a controlled setting. And then even that side, it can be somewhat like traumatic, but it's not lethal. And so again, that's another thing that would come from this is then we can start educating first responders, emergency rooms of like, okay, if this guy's on a psychedelic, this is how you kind of like bring them down so that they're not freaking out, right? And so that's another sort of benefit. But again, non-lethal. If you don't have the control, yeah, that can be a little bit traumatizing. But talking about this and providing avenues make it safer.
Yeah, so just adding on to that, exactly what Jesse said. I mean, You asked about overdose specifically. The risk of overdose with these substances is slim to none. There's no substance that is zero risk for any bad outcome. That doesn't exist. But in comparison to both legal substances today, as well as other types of quote unquote recreational drugs, the risk is extremely low. That really the concern is what Jesse alluded to, is a quote unquote bad trip. The bill includes a directive to the Department of Public Health to work on and develop training and outreach for both first responders and the public at large to learn about how to manage these substances, what are best practices, and also how to manage if, say, a first responder interacts with somebody who is experiencing a quote unquote bad trip. What are best practices to handle that and to deal with it safely and get that person back on track. But that's really the risk we're talking about, and that risk is fairly low. We can provide you with the actual studies and the numbers around this, and we'd be happy to follow up with that. But it has been studied, and in terms of physical safety, these are very safe with very high upside in terms of the benefits and both therapeutic and just personal that people can experience.
And they're also relatively low. People kind of do apples to apples with cannabis, but it's a completely different market, it's completely different consumption. Cannabis lends itself a little bit more to more frequent use and common use. Psychedelics, like there is microdosing, but that's a sub-perceptual amount. That's really not going to affect anybody. That macro doses, most people are not going to do that on a very regular basis. So again, we're just in terms of the use of this, psychedelics are not a high abuse drug by any means, and all the numbers flush that out.
Can you guys explain what the current research landscape is in terms of psychedelics, like how studies on therapeutic practices get done in the current environment, and if this bill would either influence that or maybe it wouldn't? If you could just kind of speak to the dynamic a bit.
Yeah, and I'm sure Jesse can add to this. I mean, there are quite a few studies, some affiliated with the FDA, others at the various research universities. It is there are legal, authorized, peer-reviewed studies that have happened and that are happening. There's also more efforts to get government funding for these. Even like Rick Perry was supporting a bill in the Texas legislature to fund it. I can't remember if that passed or not, but
it did.
It did, yeah. There has been,
and Utah as well.
Yeah, there's been bipartisan support for funding these studies.
There's a wide variety of them. They tend to mostly be clinical because that's the way like the system works. The FDA system is that in order to be able to prescribe this substance for depression or this substance for blah, 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 you have to actually do clinical trials and get it accepted through that, which is really hard because most of these don't have patents and nobody's going to invest hundreds of millions of dollars to study. Same thing with what we see with cannabis, right? Like it's the medical system or the FDA's trials is more for potential profitable sort of medications. But so there are the clinical levels starting to come back into the universities. Johns Hopkins is one of the big leaders, and they tend to do it a substance for a specific issue. So psilocybin for alcohol, psilocybin's in FDA right now for depression, MDMA for PTSD. That will allow therapists to prescribe it off label, but again, an ideal situation is that it's approved for various sort of things because it's a different way of approaching it and liability and all this other kind of stuff. So they have been doing that, huge investment. Other side, we do sort of observational studies. So what does it look like in the field of people actually doing this, not in the sort of sterile landscape. But yeah, there's many different things, combination things. The one we're doing with the University of Texas is 3 parts psilocybin and transcranial magnetic stimulation, and then ayahuasca and the same sort of thing. So it's but it's tricky because, like I said, each one you have to do that. Whereas when you open up these sort of laws with the decriminalization, it allows the science a little bit more time while you're still giving people sort of humane access to these treatments that we're showing has been working, with very low risk.
I wanted to ask, you mentioned a little bit in your answer just now, but are these specifically for people who have like deep traumas, or is this also okay for general use for people with like generalized anxiety disorder, or is there like a level of trauma that these would need to be used for, or is it something that the general public, which I think a lot of people are facing a lot of anxiety and depression these days, especially after the pandemic, could be interested in and could use?
Yeah, absolutely. This will require sort of a changing perception of how we treat mental health. Traditionally, we kind of treat mental health like a broken bone of like, you have this is a procedure you do, this is a specific medication you take, you're good to go. But obviously mental health is a much more complex issue that is coupled with all sorts of other things: isolation, financial insecurity, head trauma, all this other kind of stuff. And with psychedelics, they're complex molecules and they interact with our brain in a complex way. And so it doesn't matter, they can be very effective for very high levels and complex PTSD. A lot of our veterans have childhood trauma that gets revealed, and then that's sort of the basis of other traumas coming on top of that. But it's also not just getting rid of trauma, it's also allowing people to thrive in life. People come from this like truly inspired and ready to tackle life, reinvigorated with life. And so even small scales, you can really look at this as sort of self-optimization, and when done, respectfully in certain avenues. So I've seen the whole spectrum of people get some sort of benefit, because it really is, it's allowing you to kind of see your own psyche from a different lens without sort of the normal barriers and restrictions that we generally have in a sober state, which is why it's so effective. And that's why like people can be in therapy for 10, 15, 20 years, limited effect. They go through MDMA therapy or psilocybin therapy. They have some of the biggest breakthroughs they ever had because, again, in that sober state, we are so good at compartmentalizing or putting up these walls of these structures that allow us to survive. But breaking those down is necessary to overcome trauma when you're supported.
It's my understanding that psilocybins and psychoactive drugs have trouble working at the same time as SSRIs, which I believe a majority, like I think most people who are depressed, if they're on medication, it's usually an SSRI. So is there anything in the bill that provides some sort of like help for people who first would have to wean themselves off of the SSRI in order to do this sort of program?
I mean, just to be clear, the bill is a decriminalization. It's about saying we're going to stop arresting people for possessing and using these substances. That's what the bill does in terms of people, sort of medical complexities. That the bill doesn't sort of manage those complexities. People would obviously need to talk to their physicians, although that is complex too because of the federal criminalization. Physicians are in a tough spot, and that's why having trained therapists who know are experts in psychedelics, I think, is an important thing, and that's why we've created this task force, a working group, to make recommendations on those kinds of broader next steps.
Yeah, that's really the part of the bill that gets to that, is the task force that's going to be set up to work through specifically a lot of these issues, right? There's 2 reports called for under the task force. One is the first responder and public education piece, and the second is what the senator just said, working through a lot of these questions on what should we be doing in California for therapeutic access or other questions about this policy going forward.
And not maybe direct cause of the bill, but we also have to look at what this allows and what this brings about, right? And if we start having these infrastructures, because I already see this now, even though it's still federally illegal, but now that therapists are more aware that there are other options in psychedelics, they have to be careful with their liability, but they can actually now help their patients get off SSRIs because they know there's an alternative. If I was just having you come down off these medications and there's no alternative, then that's the case. But I've seen that many times where therapists are excited because they see the potential of people getting off and staying off as a result of these medications. And so this is just sort of this bill, the first step. But then that starts these conversations and this understanding of like, hey, there is going to be more things out there. Again, when we keep it illegal, it just really it really limits conversations and looking towards the future right now. Like right now, we're just keeping ourselves in the dark. At least it starts a conversation of like, what does the next 10 years look like with these modalities?
I don't know as much about this as Yusuf or Josh or Robin, and certainly not as much as our panelists do. But Jesse, it would really help me to understand this better in terms of how you turn to psychedelics and what and expand more on what they do for you that the standard treatment, say for alcohol abuse, didn't.
Was the first part of like how I specifically found them. I was just at kind of my rope's end. Like I was just unhappy, and there were no answers. Like I tried the traditional means, and they kind of did this rubber stamp blanket PTSD without looking further at it. And the only thing was medication, again, with the understanding of you're going to have PTSD. This is how you can live with it, right? And I just didn't like that answer. I heard about somebody talking about a psychedelic on a podcast, kind of first pushed it off of like, that's an interesting story, but it didn't have any appeal to me. But the more I looked into it, the more I just saw a tremendous amount of anecdotal evidence that people were having their lives changed. And so I just got to that point personally where it was like my life was going downhill and I clearly didn't have the tools to fix it. I was kind of at my rope's end. Let's give this a shot, right? Like, why not? Like, when you've tried all the acceptable answers, maybe you have to think outside the box and see how that goes. So, I mean, it's still very early stages in terms of understanding exactly how this works. But there's a few different factors, and each substance is a little bit different. So, for instance, MDMA, it brings inherently at certain dosages with a therapist, it brings about these feelings of trust and openness. So people are much more, they're not as closed off. They don't have these walls, but then they also build that trust with their therapist much easier. That's one of the hardest things in a therapeutic setting is that trust and have that vulnerability. And so it's a very sort of open emotioner. And so it really augments traditional talk therapy because that's the things therapists often have trouble with. They hit these walls of, we compartmentalize and we don't get past that. And so it opens that up and allows them something like a hallucinogenic, like psilocybin. Again, it's similar sort of thing, but it tends to be you almost becoming your own therapist within your head. It helps to have the talk side of it before and afterwards to get you in that mode and help you sort of talk about it. But basically, the belief is it shuts down something called the default mode network, like what our brain puts us back into our old patterns. It also suppresses the ego and kind of it suppresses the forebrain, the controlling brain, and brings up sort of the subconscious where we store a lot of these traumas. So when that comes up in the altered state, it brings up these strong emotional sort of things, often with the visual aspect. And so it's almost like your own therapist where it's like, oh, what is this? Why am I depressed? And it brings it up. And then because it stimulates the brain when it lights up and makes new neural connections, it can help you like release certain trauma. Like I said, with veterans, they often see like some sort of childhood abuse, and it helps them reframe it in their mind because they're in this state. But then it also helps them see that that's the root cause of all this other kind of stuff in a processing. There's also evidence that some of these substances reduce inflammation in the brain and possibly heal the brain. So a lot of veterans have micro traumatic brain injury just from being exposed to concussive force. I was included in that because I was trained on mortar systems. So just on a day-to-day basis, just explosion. The VA was behind the times, so they didn't diagnose it, but that's what we're seeing more and more with veterans. So there's evidence of that physical side. And then there's the evidence of it's kind of a trickier aspect because it's not something you can, we're getting there, but it's kind of more of the sense of community, lack of isolation, and connectivity, which is a very unique feature of a psychedelic where people after that, especially if they're doing with this group therapy context, come from, because isolation is such a key factor in a lot of this, in suicidation and mental health trauma. And so finally, like, understanding that they can be a part of something and feeling it, it really brings up this like self-love, these self-feelings, but actually understanding and actually feeling it. And so it's a very sort of complex. The traditional medication model, when they study it, like an SSRI, it tends to be one specific chemical doing one specific thing to a receptor, right? And it can be helpful, but you have to look at that as almost like a sledgehammer. Like, you're just kind of trying to build a whole house with a sledgehammer. Like, if you don't know exactly what you're doing, then it might work somewhat, but you're not going to get the most efficient product. With psychedelics and some of these other plants, we co-evolve with it. There's a lot of evidence. There's always been evidence of ceremonial, traditional sort of aspects, and so our brains react to it because it's been sort of in the human sphere for quite a while.
And scientists have that, what Jesse said about the effects on the default mode network have actually been mapped in the brain in various studies. It's really fascinating stuff. Michael Pollan covers it in his book, How to Change Your Mind. And the science behind that is really fascinating because it points to how physically and scientifically these substances are making those changes that we've known about for millennia, that indigenous people and people on this continent and elsewhere have known about and felt that effect of broadening your perspective, feeling more connected to others in your community, and sense of spiritual growth and other things like that. We can actually identify the scientific kind of basis for that, which is really interesting.
One of the things that folks always push back on when there's a change in drug laws is, there'll be increased access to young people and this overexposure. How have you guys responded to that critique?
And it's first of all, young people have access now. This doesn't change that. The bill is limited to 21 and older. It doesn't change the laws around banning selling. And so I don't see this really changing anything in terms of the extent to which young people have access. It's not even creating a legal market. It's simply saying we're going to stop arresting.
Yeah, so exactly. This does not change the rules for possession on school grounds, providing to a minor, selling, smuggling, transporting, any of those things. We've actually had experience with this. So this as new as this is to Sacramento and to the capital, Oregon, Denver, Oakland, Washington, D.C., a number of other municipalities, as well as other countries like Portugal and elsewhere, have already gone down this path, and we have extensive experience with this. There's actually a study that we can again provide to you that actually looked at this in Denver after they decriminalized or downgraded, the penalty for psilocybin, and it showed zero impact on how many people sought to use these substances. The bottom line is people who want to do them will do them and find a way. And if it's illegal, that use will be more dangerous, both to them in their life and also, in their use. So
I was just going to say quickly of like the kind of messaging has changed since we started this. And if you talk to anybody that's been doing the research, it's very apparent that more than likely psychedelics are here to stay in a mental health context. Like, it's coming. It's going to take some while to go through the FDA process. So we have this unique opportunity where we can see what's going to happen. And so these sort of measures are we prepared? Because we're not prepared right now. And that's sort of the problem with these sort of legality structures, is when it becomes legal, then that's almost like a light switch. And then you have to scramble to like, how do we implement this in our society and how do we do the right education? Do we have the right trained practitioners? All of that becomes needlessly hard to prepare for an inevitability because of the ways laws and liabilities are. And so that's kind of more of this of like, let's look at the evidence and like, okay, more than likely that's coming. So let's start making the measures right now to make sure that we are prepared and we can actually like roll this out on a time frame that we choose, not something else.
I know you have another question. I just want to really agree and thank Jesse for raising that point. That's what the senator has done here, is tried to put forward a responsible and thoughtful construct, as opposed to what, you know, others out there in the world may want to move forward immediately with some kind of broad commercialization where you're, you know, along the lines of what we had for cannabis. We don't believe that's a responsible approach, and we think that California really does need to grapple now with what this is going to look like, because it's going to happen. It's going to happen one way or the other, and we need to put in place a responsible, measured, sort of step-by-step process before we get there. Sorry, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you have any information on how many people in California right now are being arrested and punished for these drugs.
We don't have hard numbers. People who are arrested and prosecuted will be arrested and prosecuted under sort of the broader drug laws in the penal code. So it's very difficult to differentiate if somebody was, you know, imprisoned for a large amount of, you know, cannabis trafficking or heroin or mushrooms or what the substance was, right? You know, it's admittedly less than other drugs. The quote unquote hard drugs are really, you know, that's the majority of street enforcement in the state and in this country. But people who dismiss, there are those who dismiss, like, oh, no one's getting arrested for psychedelics anyway. That is not true. People have had their lives ruined over the last 30 years, and including recently and today, for merely possessing psychedelic substances. And, you know, as we know, you know, the enforcement of all of our drug laws are extremely racially disparate, and disparate on the basis of geography and class. So, you know, sure, there may be folks in Hollywood having, you know, psychedelics parties and it's all good and no one bothers them. That does not mean that the people who are over-policed in this country and in our drug war in general and throughout the state are not getting arrested and prosecuted, which they are. But the short answer is we do not have hard numbers because those don't exist.
But the other piece of it is, regardless of who or how many people are getting arrested, when people know that a substance is illegal, they act in a more secretive way. They're going to be less likely to try to get safety information, to talk to people. It's all going to be in the shadows, and that's what criminalization does. So it makes people, let's say, if we want people to be able to be very public and to go and seek information and help and not worry that I'm doing something bad and I might get arrested.
100%.
Yeah, and that's actually happening. You know, like, even if it's not this wide scale, like psilocybin crackdown, it's a mentality of what you're going into it. And so veterans are already pursuing this, whether underground or overseas, both of which is, you know, should be embarrassing to anybody that hears that. But they are going to do it because it's similar to myself, something that's shown to be effective. And if that's their, you know, the last tether they have to life. But when you're doing it within the US, this is a question we always get of, like, you know, am I going to be arrested? Because these are people who, you know, are law-abiding citizens. You know, they are doing this to save their lives, not because they're druggies or anything like that. And so if you do this or go into a ceremony with that worry that you might be arrested or something, like, that's a horrible way to go into this. But it's also like, what do we want these laws to say? Of, like, if you're trying to do something to help your mental health and you're a criminal in this country, especially if you're a veteran and you're just trying to save your own life, but the law views you as a criminal, that's what we're trying to change here. You know, we're acknowledging that there is a high potentiality that these can help people, and we've seen that. And so now we're allowing people who just have that right to heal themselves, and these groups that deserve it the most. And so that's sort of the shift of it. Like, when you have those changes of, hey, you're not a criminal, there's still going to be laws and all this other kind of stuff of when you can't, but then it just takes that off.
What are you guys, you know, facing in the assembly right now? And obviously it's passed out of the Senate. So, but what are you guys facing right now? And Has the governor expressed a position or lent support in any way? What's it kind of looking like in terms of passage at this point?
The governor has not stated a position on it. We've of course met with his staff to make sure they know what we're doing, but he's not stated a position. In the assembly, we did, last August when we were in the Assembly Appropriations Committee, we hit the pause button and asked for the bill to become a 2-year bill to give us more time to work with assembly members and build more support. So we think we do have a path to pass it on the assembly floor if it comes off the suspense file. We met with the chair of the Appropriations Committee, who has a long track record supporting criminal justice reform. And so we think we have a shot at getting it off suspense, and we think we have a path on the floor. It will, as with any bill like this, it's always going to be, it's not going to be a landslide, but we do have a path. And there are assembly members supporting this who are not sort of the usual suspects like me, who support, every drug policy bill. So I think we have a really pretty diverse group of members supporting it, as we did in the Senate.
If you look at our co-author list, you'll see the broad range across the caucus that support this. So yeah, there's definitely a path if we get off suspense.
Where is the organized opposition coming from?
There really is no organized opposition. I mean, the only significant law enforcement group that's opposed to it is the police chiefs. And we've been working with them, and that's a work in progress. We're having conversations with them, and they're being reasonable. So we think we're going to get to the point where there's no significant opposition to the bill.
Would agree with that. And if you watch the policy hearings, there really was no organized opposition. The chiefs did not prioritize this, and did not speak against it. So it's really a matter of educating members, because there's it's kind of a blank slate. This is an issue that folks may not have focused on or know much about. But we found that really, it is a blank slate for a lot of folks. And once they meet with Jesse, once they meet with, our law enforcement folks, our doctors, the parents of folks who have defeated addiction, our indigenous partners and therapists, they see the value in the bill, and they vote for it. So it's really been an interesting process in that respect. It's not a traditional bill with a clear left right or a clear support oppose in terms of interest groups in Sacramento.
If the bill passed and were signed into law, how would one access psychedelics? Would it be through their the mental health services? I'm trying to visualize how that would work then.
The bill allows for personal to grow these plant-based substances at home to up to a certain amount. So that's one pathway. There's also the potential prescription pathway should the FDA process work out for some of these substances. And then Jesse, I don't know if you wanted to weigh in sort of on just any other sort of access issues there.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the complicated sort of sides of the psychedelic sort of dynamic, because even even for states that are trying to go for like a medicalized model, there's always this sense that, again, there's indigenous groups that have been doing this for thousands of years, and you can't just say this is legal, but now you can't do it. That obviously has a lot of issues and repercussions. And so and most of the actual studies, even Johns Hopkins, come from learning from these indigenous traditions and underground facilitators. So in addition to the personal use, that's why we have sort of the communal side of things, where they have communal access to a certain extent, because one, that keeps it safer, but two, then they have that group support there. So basically, from the growing, they're allowed to have a certain amount, and then they can get together in their own right, which is what we already do with veterans. But again, it's just giving them more of that infrastructure support that they would be worried about doing right now in a context that has a lot of basis and backing. And again, that's one of those issues of like, that is something that it's not guaranteed, but needs to happen as well. We can't just appropriate something and then just say other people who've been doing it long before can't do it that way. And there's religious contexts in other countries as well. So all these are discussions. And again, this is sort of that blueprint of like, we have this opportunity now to figure out what this looks like in the communities and keep it safe.
Yeah, so you can share without selling, basically.
Yes, up to a certain amount. And again, home grow is permitted, which is where I would anticipate, the majority of folks, either personally or in a communal sense, sort of access these things under 519.
And the benefit of that, like especially with these organic like psilocybin, like it's relatively easy if you have some practice to do it, and then it's also relatively safe. It's not like you're actually only going to grow a mushroom that is going to kill you. The worst case scenario is you just have a bad harvest or what have you. So like that makes it like you still have to know what you're doing, but it's a very like there's not a risk in terms of it being tainted with fentanyl or something.
You can see San Pedro cactus on your walks around Land Park in people's yards.
I noticed in the bill text the words personal use were X'd out. What was the sort of rationale for that?
I'm not sure what you're referring to. So, but use and possession are decriminalized. There was some wordsmithing that was done along the way. We used to call it social sharing. It's now called, I think, facilitated. So there have been wordsmithing over time, but the bill decriminalizes possession and use, as well as sort of group or communal or shared use.
Your colleague shared some polling that shows the public is mostly in support of this effort. Well, I'm curious kind of what each of you sort of take away from that, knowing that public sentiment does seem to have shifted.
Well, I think as with a lot of different areas, the public is like multiple steps ahead of elected officials. We see this with psychedelics. We've seen it with cannabis, where the legislature could never get it together to legalize cannabis, so the voters did it. The legislature, couldn't get it together to reform 3 strikes, so the voters did it. And we see in the polling on housing, the voters are ahead of the elected officials. So it's not surprising that just regular people, they look at this and it makes sense to them. And I think the politicians have to catch up. But in fairness, this bill, when I introduced it last year, I was like, oh, this is going to be a long-term project that I don't know. And although the votes have always been close, we got it all the way through the Senate. We got it through both of its assembly policy committees, all in its first year. And then in the second year, we have a chance to actually get it across the finish line. So it's, I'm really proud of the legislature for having an open mind on a subject that has historically been taboo.
How much of that do you think is due to Oregon sort of paving the way?
I think some of it, but I really do want to say that, Jesse and the other veterans, as well as their parents, have been incredibly impactful. And I have colleagues who were telling me that they didn't think they were going to be able to support the bill. And then they would meet with the veterans and the parents and then call me right back and say, I've changed my mind, I'm voting for it. So I think when they hear firsthand the impacts, they're more often than not persuaded.
Is there anything that was in Oregon's bill that you sort of tweaked in yours?
Oregon, there were 2 ballot measures in Oregon. There was one that decriminalized possession of all drugs, up to and including fentanyl, everything. And so that bill went way beyond. And then there was the separate one for legalizing psilocybin. And so I think people have seen that. And when we tell people, hey, we wouldn't even be the first to do this, it helps. But I think hearing the personal stories is the most powerful.
The senator covered it. I was just going to add that, I mean, the public support outside of the Capitol, just people in California, cuts across every demographic, Republican, old, young, across racial demographics. There's broad support for this. And that's why I think, just echoing that, the policy making is actually behind the curve here. And it's important that we get this done and start to put in place a system in California.
You've seen a pretty broad cultural shift too, especially in the last 5 years. I mean, if you go on Netflix right now, there's the How to Change Your Mind, based off Michael Pollan's book, and it's, you know, top 10 list. His book was a New York Times bestseller. It's just becoming kind of more, you know, we had the period where it was a backlash from what happened in the 60s and 70s, and there's a lot of stuff right there. Pretty much anybody that talked about it, psychedelics, on an academic setting were blacklisted from academia or even funding. And so nobody studied it, nobody talked about it. I think we've had enough time that passed and realized some of those original fears and justifications were pretty wrong and often racially based. And at this point, we've come to a new spot of where people are a little bit more familiar with it. You know, when I started, it's a completely different conversation. To now, you know, even the most conservative person's like looking into microdosing or this or that. You go to respected academic institutions, people can actually get their PhD studying a certain psychedelic. There's psychedelic institutions in Texas, in Johns Hopkins. The Bronx VA is actually currently doing a test case of giving veterans psychedelics. The Oregon VA are studying psilocybin. So, I mean, just broad based from an academic standpoint, from a general standpoint, I think most people realize that, like, the reaction to consider these substances as harmful, no medical benefit, and extremely addictive, I think everybody's kind of realizing the ridiculousness of that notion. And so looking for that change.